Well, welcome everyone. My name is Alejandro Velsaco. I'm assistant professor, assistant. I just devoted myself. And that was a hard slog to get tenure. So I am associate professor of Latin American history at NYU, both at the Gallatin School and the Department of History. I am delighted to welcome you to today's event, in which we are joined by Thea Riofrancos, discussing her newest book, Resource Radicals. I'm going to quickly introduce Thea. I just want to give you a rundown of today's event. I'm going to introduce Thea, who will provide us with an overview of her book. And after that, she and I will engage in a bit of a back and forth discussion. But mostly what we want to hear is from everyone here on your own questions, both on the project as well as more generally about some of the themes that that the project really elicits, which primarily have to do with questions of extractivism, but more broadly have to do with the potential for imagining an eco-socialist future, not only in places like Ecuador, which is the focus of the book, but really globally, which is the pressing task confronting all of us in the world today. I want to first thank the Urban Democracy Lab, which is sponsoring today's event. The Urban Democracy Lab is an initiative at the Gallatin School at NYU, which brings together, which promotes critical, creative, just, and sustainable forms of urbanism through engaged scholarship, collaborative undergraduate and graduate coursework, creative public programming, of which, of course, this is a part, and active publication. And if you are interested in finding out more about the Urban Democracy Lab, you can follow the website, which is urbandemos.nyu.edu, and stay tuned for upcoming events. Okay, so with that, I also now want to turn to introducing Thea, who is currently an Andrew Carnegie Fellow, a Radcliffe Institute Fellow as well, and an assistant professor of political science at Providence College. Her research focuses on resource extraction, renewable energy, climate change, green technology, social movements, and the left in Latin America. And these are the primary through threads of her book, Resource Radicals, from Petro Nationalism to Post-Extractivism in Ecuador, which was published by Duke Press in 2020. She also has written widely in both academic and non-academic outlets in places like the New York Times, The Guardian, Plus One, Dissent Jacobin in these times, NACLA. She is also the co-author of an amazing additional book called The Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, with Verso in 2019. There is much more that I can say about Thea, but I would want to hear more from her before turning to more of the accolades. So Thea, why don't I bring you in at this time?
Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Alejandro, and for you and Gianpaolo originally inviting me, and for Mehmet for coordinating, and Jennifer for coordinating the logistics of this. I've been looking forward to this for a while, and also really miss seeing you all in person. So I'm gonna just take a second to share my screen so that people can see my presentation, and that should work. And just a heads up to Alejandro or anyone else, while I'm doing this, I won't be able to see the chat. So if you need to pause me, if there's an internet issue or anything, just please interrupt me verbally. All right then. So over the past 2 decades, 2 historic processes transformed Latin America. My book, Resource Radicals, is about their intersection and their combined implications for left-wing projects that seek to transform an economic model based on rapacious resource extraction. The first process was the recent commodity boom. From 2000 to 2014, demand for primary commodities such as copper, soy, and oil soared, driven in large part by rapid industrialization in China. During the boom, the price of oil increased almost 500%, accompanied by historically high prices for raw materials across the board. In Latin America, high prices for key exports offered the opportunity of massively increased government revenues, at the same time that they dramatically increased resource dependency. This renewed economic dependency on oil, mineral, gas, and soy exports coincided with a dramatic political development, what scholars call the pink tide, during which a spate of left-wing governments came to power, beginning with Hugo Chavez in 1999. The coincidence of these two processes transformed the political economy of the region. Ballooning export revenues enabled pink tide administrations to govern from the left, making good on campaign promises to reverse austerity and significantly reduce poverty and inequality, increasing access to education and healthcare, and embarking on new infrastructural projects. But the price for improving millions of citizens' socioeconomic well-being was further fiscal dependency on natural resources, and in many cases, the territorial expansion of the extractive frontier, subjecting indigenous communities to displacement and fragile ecosystems to contamination. In other words, economic development threatened the well-being of some of these leftist governments' core constituencies. Some of the same social groups who had mobilized against the prior decade's neoliberal policies now faced a new set of social and environmental ills. In this context, resource extraction and mega development projects emerge as salient sites of conflict between pink tide governments and social movements. Resource Radicals traces these dynamics in Ecuador. The decade in which leftist Rafael Correa served as president was marked by protracted dispute over new mining and new oil projects. This conflict split the Ecuadorian left in two. On one side, indigenous and environmental movements claim that resource dependency pollutes the environment, violates collective rights, and undermines democracy. They called this model of development extractivism, or extractivismo, and fought for a post-extractive future. This stance itself represented a historic shift. Just years earlier, social movements had fought for the nationalization of natural resources. They now resisted all forms of extraction. On the other side, the Correa administration defended a pro-extraction stance, asserting that oil and mining revenues are vital for equitable economic development. They argued that this development would benefit the majority, strengthen the state, and bolster democracy, benefits that in their view far outweighed the socio-environmental costs of mining or oil. And I just want to turn our attention to the photographs here. So on the left side, this is taken in the southern highlands of SY, which was one of my field sites. You have Correa and some people from the media and his cabinet visiting the site of a planned mine. On the right side, in that same exact highland wetland called a páramo, you have anti-mining protesters that are specifically protesting against the mining law that they saw as too friendly to mining investment. And so you can see kind of in the same landscape, two different visions. And I'll get to both the mining law and the protest against it a little bit later in the talk. This dispute over resource extraction in Ecuador was a dispute between competing visions of development that were articulated and then consolidated on the fly, echoing historic debates while also forging new interests and identities and resulting in a novel kind of political conflict. This dispute speaks to a key challenge of our global moment: the urgent need for development models that are both socially just and environmentally sustainable, and for political strategies to mobilize for this aspiration. As I'll discuss at the end of this talk, this challenge is of course only intensified by the accelerating climate crisis. Leftist administrations in Latin America are ideal sites to explore these challenges, since both policymakers and movements have explicitly politicized and radicalized the relationship between development and extraction. In the process, they raise deep questions about the state, democracy, and the ecological foundations of global capitalism. Within these global and regional contexts, Ecuador is a particularly revealing site. It is among the most commodity-dependent economies on the continent and saw intense conflict between a leftist government committed to extractive development and an array of movements opposed to extraction in all forms. In this talk, I'll delve into my book's arguments, but I'll also offer a critique of how the politics of extraction tend to be depicted in social science, research, and public policy conversations. So the book, it's animated by two research questions. First, why did activists in Ecuador begin to resist what they called the extractive model? And what were the political consequences of anti-extractive protests? And again, I want to draw your attention to this photo from my field work, which was during a long protest march that will come up a bit later. For those that, it's a little hard to read, and also for those that don't speak Spanish, what it says is fuera mineras, which means mining companies get out. And it's a skull and crossbones. And the skull is wearing a miner's helmet with the name of a multinational mining company, Kinross. And the crossbones are a mining pick and shovel. And the reason I think this is such a dramatic photo is just the way that it equates mining with death via the symbolism of the skull. And I argue that this militant discourse of anti-extractivism was the product of a particular historic conjuncture, marked by the leftist President Rafael Correa's inauguration, a constituent assembly that rewrote the Constitution, and the administration's promotion of large-scale mining, a new extractive sector in an already oil-dependent country. Anti-extractivism, which was a product of these specific historic circumstances, fractured the leftist coalition. It drove a wedge between Correa and his erstwhile social movement allies, and even caused conflict within the state itself, between bureaucrats with distinct visions of extraction. So in the remainder of this talk, I'm going to walk us through the history that led up to this dramatic intra-left conflict. First, I'll situate Ecuador a bit more in global and regional context, drawing out some of the deeper motivations for my book. Then I'll say a bit about research methods, as well as the specific sites that I researched ethnographically. With that context in place, I'll delve into the book's argument, as well as my critique of what scholars call the, quote, resource curse. And to conclude, I'll bring us up to the present, saying a word about my current research, as well as contemporary politics in Ecuador, which we can also discuss more in the question and answer period. So first, the motivations for this book. What does protest in Ecuador against extraction tell us about broader global dynamics? Around the world, the extractive frontier is expanding to new territories. In Latin America, between 2000 and 2014, high prices for oil, minerals, and gas spurred an intensification of extraction, especially in the Andes and Amazon. Closer to home, the advent of fracking for oil and gas in the US has transformed the landscapes of Texas, the Northeast, and the Great Plains. Several recent studies have noted an important shift in the social contention surrounding the exploitation of these resources. Historically, much of the conflict focused on issues such as labor or ownership. But more recently, resistance to extraction increasingly centers on environmental and cultural concerns and invokes new international rights that protect local communities and particularly indigenous peoples. Anti-extractive protests in Ecuador is emblematic of this broader shift. It emerged in response to the government's attempt to develop a new extractive sector that would affect new territories, ecosystems, and populations, large-scale mining. The eruption of militant protest against the expansion of the extractive frontier highlights dramatic changes in the political economy of extraction across the region. The global commodity boom triggered an economic reorientation in Latin America. Even in this regional context, however, Ecuador stands out as one of the most resource-dependent economies on the continent, actually often is vying with Venezuela for the country whose exports are most composed of raw materials. And this gives you a sense of Ecuador in regional context. So first we have Latin America, then South America, then Ecuador. And what this is measuring is the percentage of exports that are primary, non-industrialized products. These could be agricultural or extractive. And the Correa government, it's worth noting, which governed from 2007 to 2017, benefited more from oil price increases than any other prior administration had since Ecuador democratized in 1979. Oil revenues financed over a third of the state budget. But even before the 2014 oil crash, social spending outpaced these revenues. Meanwhile, most of Ecuador's mineral reserves remain unexploited, and the prices for metals such as gold and copper were historically high. In this context, Correa pursued large-scale mining as a new source of state income and, in his view, as a means of bringing development to communities in the Amazon and Southern Sierra. With two such contracts now in effect, the era of large-scale mining has officially been inaugurated. Social movements consistently resisted Correa's attempts to expand extraction. These movements include the national and regional indigenous organizations, which in the 1990s were considered by scholars to be among the most highly mobilized movements in the entire hemisphere for their proven ability to topple multiple presidential administrations. Indeed, indigenous mobilization was key in that broader trajectory that brought a left-wing government to power in the first place. But once his extractive commitments became clear, Correa became a target of indigenous protests, oftentimes in alliance with local anti-mining and anti-oil groups, as well as community water associations. Militant environmental organizations, oftentimes but not always based in urban areas, were also part of the anti-extractive coalition, radicalizing environmental discourse of Ecuadorian activists. So with those contexts in view, I'm going to say just a brief word about my fieldwork. I conducted 15 months of fieldwork over 6 years, which consisted of multi-sided ethnography. I'll show you where in a moment, over 100 interviews, a participant observation of 40 events ranging from mining industry conventions to a 2-week-long protest march that covered 700 kilometers from the southern Amazon to the capital that I showed you a photograph of earlier. I also conducted archival work as well as textual analysis of documents and videos. So here to give you a little bit of a sense both of where Ecuador is in South America, that's on the west coast in the Pacific Ocean, and also where my field sites within Ecuador are. So I spent quite a bit of time in the capital, obviously a center of policymaking, but also corporate headquarters, as well as social movement headquarters. I also spent time in Azuay, which we saw some photographs of earlier, which was home to a planned mining project, as was Zamora Chinchipe, all the way in the south in the Amazon bordering Peru. So at the time of my field work, the planned gold mine, then called the Quimsacocha project in the southern Azuay, was the most embattled. There was just consistent protest against it. And actually to this day, it has remained stalled. So now 9 years later, this mine still hasn't been developed because of the degree of protest. In contrast, the mine in Zamora Chinchipe was actually Ecuador's first large-scale open pit copper mine, again in the sort of where the foothills of the Andes meet the Amazon, signed with a Chinese state-owned consortium, and the mine is now in production. So it gives you a little bit of a sense of the range of outcomes across different strategic mining projects. So now back to my book's argument. To understand the historic roots and actually the novelty of anti-extractive movements, my narrative begins with the earlier historic period. For the decade and a half of social mobilization that began with Ecuador's first national indigenous uprising in 1990, indigenous activists, often in coalition with other popular sector groups, identified neoliberalism as the target of their resistance. In their struggle against neoliberalism, these groups asserted that natural resources, such as oil, should be the collective property of the people. They claimed to defend sovereignty and life itself against the private and often foreign appropriation of national wealth. So, for example, during massive protests against neoliberal reforms in 1994, the political program of the National Indigenous Federation, the CONAI, defined, quote, non-renewable and subsoil resources, in other words, oil and minerals, as the property of the plurinational state that they hoped to found through their struggle. 4 years later, in their proposal for the 1998 Constitution, the same federation stated that oil and mining should be national property. Thus, during these years of intense protests against cuts to public spending, privatizations, and other market reforms, the National Indigenous Federation, which was a key protagonist in a broader protest movement, demanded the nationalization of natural resources for the benefit of the people. I call this vision radical resource nationalism. This, of course, has a long history in Latin America, where throughout the 20th century, and in many cases to the present, left movements have seen extraction through the lens of anti-imperialism, rejecting foreign ownership and demanding national and democratic forms of resource sovereignty. Correa entered the 2006 presidential race riding the coattails of this history of mass mobilization, and capitalizing on his already established anti-neoliberal credentials. He had previously served as a finance minister and had made it clear that he was a critic of neoliberalism. But with his rise to power, indigenous movements and their allies abandoned their prior resource nationalist stance. They re-articulated their position as the total opposition to extraction, away from earlier nationalist rhetoric of resources for the people. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a taste of what this discourse and tactics looks like before returning to the argument of why did this emerge in this particular moment. So, for example, in July of 2010, a prominent member of a human rights organization that focuses on environmental conflict told me that, quote, extractivismo was to blame for a wide range of problems in Ecuador. The sale of land to oil and mining companies and the construction of infrastructure to support extraction resulted in what she called a new colonization of the countryside. But she also observed that the expansion of extraction opened up new possibilities for collective action, such as an emergent alliance between indigenous groups and small farmers or campesinos in the southern Amazon, who both saw a common enemy in the advancing extractive frontier. This discourse, it's important to note, was not restricted to social movements, and that fact, I think, is emblematic of its political power. It circulated among actors that I call critical bureaucrats, members of the Correa administration who were more hesitant and in some cases opposed to extraction. So a week after I spoke to that human rights activist, I sat down with the legislative advisor to Alianza País, Correa's political party, who was later appointed to the Ministry of Economic Policy, so a quite high-ranking official in the government. He spoke to me of, quote, two grand projects in contradiction. On one side, he said, is the development model that was promoted by the government, and in particular Correa, based on the, quote, super exploitation of nature and extractivism. He contrasted this with buen vivir, the indigenous concept of living well, now enshrined in the Constitution, a model that he defined as not so much economic, but as civilizational, envisioning a total reordering of the relationship between individual, community, and nature. So with that kind of sense of what anti-extractive discourse looks like in mind, I want to return and repose my research questions. Why did activists begin to adopt this discourse, and what were the effects of anti-extractivism? I argue that the inauguration of leftist President Correa and the rewriting of the Constitution provided the political opening for the emergence of anti-extractive movements. In a national referendum in 2007, Ecuadorians voted overwhelmingly in favor of convening a constituent assembly to rewrite the Constitution. This had been a long-standing social movement demand. Correa's party, Alianza País, won almost 2/3 of the delegate seats. During the assembly, however, some Alianza País delegates, as well as members in other left-wing parties, including the indigenous party Pachacutic, and their social movement allies outside the assembly, began to craft a vision of anti-extractivism. Their framing drew on radical environmentalist proposals that dated to the early 1990s, indigenous discourses about territorial sovereignty and collective rights, and emergent environmentalist critiques circulating around the hemisphere of Latin America's pink tide governments. The definition that these activists use of extractivism varies, but I'll give you a basic definition with common threads. It refers to an export-led model of accumulation based on the intensive extraction, or in agricultural context, of harvesting of natural resources with little or no industrialization. Anti-extractive activists saw that this model contaminates ecosystems, centralizes political power, undermines democracy, and violates constitutional rights, including the constitutional rights that they were in the midst of drafting after the Constitution was ratified. But Correa's rise to power and the subsequent Constituent Assembly debates weren't sufficient conditions. They were an opening, but they weren't sufficient to consolidate anti-extractivism as the critical discourse that would recast the terms of political conflict. So I argue that another factor was necessary: the promotion of a new extractive sector, large-scale mining. Large-scale mining was a centerpiece of Correa's economic agenda. In the context of booming prices for largely untapped national reserves of gold and copper, Correa looked to this new sector to boost state revenue and underwrite public investment in social services and infrastructure that had already outpaced oil revenues. But despite these potential benefits, large-scale and especially open-pit mining entails dire consequences for directly affected communities and ecosystems. Moreover, the energy and transportation infrastructure mining requires contributes to deforestation and, in turn, climate change. As a result, both promoters and detractors saw mining as a path to be taken or avoided at all costs. From the administration's perspective, mining would alleviate poverty. For anti-extractive activists, it would entrench economic dependency, territorial dispossession, and environmental degradation. For both sides, then, an entire model of development was at stake. The 2009 mining law, which I mentioned earlier, was the first in a series of pro-mining reforms. The protests it occasioned, organized by a then nascent coalition of national and regional indigenous federations, radical environmentalists, and local anti-mining groups, were the first inkling of the coming political realignment. During these protests, a press release circulated by the Highland Indigenous organization, Ecuador, which had played a key role in mobilizing against neoliberalism in the 90s, highlighted the new salience of an anti-extractive framing. So I'll read you the quote from the press release. Overcoming the neoliberal model cannot be achieved with policies of a developmentalist and extractivist model that promotes the extraction of economic resources at whatever cost and reproduces a social economic structure of inequality, injustice, discrimination, and the exploitation of human beings and nature. And I just want to note that I think one of the very telling pieces of this quote is how it's kind of emerging and being articulated at the intersection of two different critical discourses. One is the outgoing discourse that is anti-neoliberal, and you see the word neoliberal used there, which would be used less and less over time, actually. And then the second is the anti-extractivist discourse, which Cholango, the leader, dwells more on. It was in the context of a leftist administration then committed to intensifying extraction, in which anti-neoliberal discourse, which had been so salient for the prior decades, lost some of its critical traction. Indeed, the government identified as post-neoliberal. In that context, activists crafted a new language of contention, focused on what they then began to call the extractive model. Throughout my fieldwork, I observed anti-extractive discourse circulate widely through activist networks, in public events, in closed-door meetings, and in print media. In these venues, I observed that activists crafted strikingly similar narratives. For example, at an event organized by anti-mining activists in the province of Azuay, one of my field sites, Alberto Acosta, who had served actually under Correa as a Minister of Energy and Mines and as president of that constituent assembly that rewrote the Constitution, but left the administration precisely due to his misgivings over extraction and violations of indigenous rights, called extractivism the, quote, essence of development, understood as a 500-year-long history of the imposition of Western modernity. From his perspective, overcoming extractivism would entail an entirely new model of accumulation. A member of radical environmentalist group Acción Ecológica presented a quite similar account during a public debate over mining in the northern highland province of Imbabura. She used the opportunity to delve into a sweeping history of extractivismo, dating it to 1534, the year of the Spanish conquest of Quito, the moment of the, quote, insertion into the world market. But even within this sweeping account, for anti-extractive activists, the Correa administration stood out as the, quote, most extractivist government in Ecuador's history, in large part due to the promotion of large-scale mining. As conflict over extraction intensified, anti-extractivism became the language of contention, guiding movements and states. It circulated in symbiotic relationship with the administration's unrelenting push for new extractive projects. Each and every node in the extractive model constituted a potential target of mobilization. So protest was as likely to erupt in the streets of Quito outside of a government ministry as it was in the immediate sites of mineral and oil extraction. Anti-extractive movements, due to their ability to mobilize, forced the Correa administration to explicitly defend mineral extraction. Throughout his administration and in direct response to episodes of anti-extractive protest, Correa asserted that extraction is good for development and democracy because the revenues it generates benefit the majority of the population, including communities directly affected by its socio-environmental consequences. Ironically, in a way, he in effect redeployed movement's own prior framing of resource nationalism to criticize anti-extractivism. And so you can see these quotes here: "We can't be beggars on a sack of gold. With responsible mining, we can escape poverty." So he's basically in a way recycling this idea that extraction should be used to fund redistribution and to combat poverty, which were some of social movements' prior demands. Of course, they were not per se demanding the expansion of extraction, but they were demanding that its revenues be used for social good. And his administration put this argument into practice, directing the proceeds from royalties and taxes to fund infrastructure and social services. During his time in office, poverty dropped dramatically from 37 to 23%, the largest drop in Ecuador's history. But in Ecuador, from the moment they emerged, anti-extractive movements also caused conflict within the state. So Correa is just one of several state stances vis-a-vis extraction. Official resource policy became a field of contention. After the Constituent Assembly, as I've noted a few times now, officials with anti-extractivist sympathies, such as Alberto Acosta, left the government, and opposition politicians began to identify as anti-mining and anti-oil, so extraction became this point of political polarization. By the time I conducted fieldwork, anti-extractivism had circulated well beyond networks of social movement activists. Bureaucrats, especially those tasked with long-term economic planning, now claimed that a post-extractive economy, an imagined future in which Ecuador was no longer economically dependent on raw materials, provided a solution to what they saw as persistent underdevelopment and ongoing socio-environmental conflict. Somewhat counterintuitively then, they justified the expansion of extraction in the present in the form of these new mining projects in terms of the revenues it would generate in the future to transform the economy. Large-scale mining, a sector still in its early stages of construction, was to be the beginning of an end, a quote, post-oil vision, as one bureaucrat told me, or as another official said, quote, the last moment of extraction. At the same time, bureaucrats, their colleagues that were more directly involved in negotiating with mining companies and attracting mining investment, were forced to respond to both anti-extractive activists on the one hand and their more skeptical, critical colleagues on the other. Correa was the foremost among these defenders of extraction. He branded activists as infants and traitors, accusing them of terrorism and resulting in legal action against hundreds of indigenous and environmental activists. At the end, and this is a particularly tragic moment, at the end of his last term in office, he deployed military and police against Shuar indigenous communities who protested their displacement by another Chinese-owned mining project. At this juncture, I want to sort of step back into the public policy and mass media conversation on these topics and put a little distance between my own approach to studying extraction and this notion of the resource curse, which is the most common way to interpret resource politics and is probably familiar to many of you. According to this framework, states that depend on oil or mining for their revenues are likely to be authoritarian and economically underdeveloped. Oil or mining rents are the glue that holds elites together, enabling them to buy off or repress civil society and insulating themselves from popular pressure. The result is either low-quality democracies or stable autocracies, sustained by bloated public sectors. In contrast to these arguments, my book demonstrates that oil or minerals do not homogeneously determine political outcomes. Instead, the consequences of extraction are highly context dependent, and the interests of actors, including state actors, should not be assumed a priori. So in Ecuador, as in other commodity-dependent left populist governments in the region, from Bolivia to Venezuela to Argentina, Brazil, resource revenues were in fact a double-edged sword, a kind of contradiction. In the short term, they enabled these administrations to govern from the left, buoying high approval ratings and electoral victories. But in the long term, they locked in an extractive model of development, undermining the possibility of social and economic transformation and driving a wedge between these governments and some of their former political allies. Furthermore, in sharp contrast to the depiction of civil society that prevails in the scholarship, the activists that I studied were not merely passive recipients of oil spending or victims of state repression. Instead, they articulated novel critiques of extraction, opening up new arenas of conflict, both between movements and the state and within the state itself. As a result, activists and even some state bureaucrats rejected an extractive model of development altogether, an outcome that would be surprising if not completely inexplicable within the resource curse framework. Defying simplistic analyses of civil society Anti-extractive movements in Ecuador were creative, working through and against political institutions to achieve their goals. They elected anti-extractive leaders to local government. They marched from the Amazon to the capital. They organized nature walks through the still verdant sites slated for extractive ruin and occupied the mining camps erected on their dispossessed land. They monitored impacts on water, air, and species habitats. And frustrated with the legal system, they took the enforcement of their constitutional rights into their own hands, organizing the very consultations in communities affected by extractive projects that the government had failed to implement. These tactics had a deep impact on politics in Ecuador and beyond. The national territory and the natural resources it contains constitute the literal foundations of the state. In resisting the extraction of natural resources, indigenous and environmental movements across the Americas have called into question this taken for granted relationship between state, nation, territory, resources. To conclude, I want to note that although the narrative of my book primarily covers the decade between 2007 and 2017, as well as the historical background that preceded it, the topics it grapples with remain salient. As I think we'll discuss a bit in the question and answer, recent elections in Ecuador actually featured representatives of both of these visions of the left, the resource nationalist, Correísta vision, and also the anti-extractive vision. Further, the themes explored in my book are only growing in relevance as climate change intensifies and new forms of extraction take hold, threatening communities, territories, and ecosystems around the world. Currently, I'm researching the extractive frontiers of green technologies like lithium batteries and electric vehicles, and the environmental and social impact of lithium extraction in Chile, as well as in the United States and Europe. I'm happy to discuss that as well in Q&A. But just to finally conclude now, I'd like to pivot a bit to the future horizons of radical politics in the region. Given that during the pink tide, the Ecuadorian left fractured, pitting movements against a progressive government they had initially critically supported, I want to highlight the urgent necessity, in my view, of both left governments and left movements. For the foreseeable future, achieving socioeconomic equality on a livable planet constitutes the key political task for the hemisphere and, of course, the globe. For all the limitations and contradictions and dilemmas of the pink tide, without the left in power occupying the halls of government, political, social, and economic inequalities mutually reinforce, denying a dignified life to the vast majority and protecting the privileges of the few. And of course, for all the difficulties and challenges of sustaining anti-extractive movements, resistance against oil, coal, gas, and large-scale mining is vital to avert the worst of climate chaos and ecological devastation. So despite the potential, as Ecuador dramatizes, for conflict between the left in power and the left in resistance, these two projects are fundamentally intertwined. What is the possibility then of Latin American leftists reconstructing political coalitions that can weave together egalitarian and ecological demands? The future, it's like a cliche to say, is quite unpredictable. But there are emergent paradigms in the region, such as the call for a new eco-social pact or Pacto Ecosocial, the framework of Nuestra América Verde, our Green America, which I'm also happy to discuss, that articulate an inspiring vision for a green and socially just regional economy. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Here's where there would be a lot of applause, 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 applause. Thank you so much, Thea. I really appreciate that wonderful presentation, as well as the themes that you highlight. So I have a few questions for you just to get things started. There are a few others in the Q&A, and you should also feel free to include your comments and questions there. However, since we don't have a tremendously burgeoning crowd, if you want to have a chance to talk with Thea, just raise your hand and we'll unmute you. Okay. Okay. So just a few thoughts that I had, both from reading the book and then from hearing you speak about it a little bit more. You know, the first one, I think one of the elements that's really fascinating that you describe in the book is the relationship not between these two versions of the left and neoliberalism, but really to liberalism in general, right? And to the question of who and what is a right-bearing subject. And there's, you know, a really fascinating discussion in your book as to the Constitutional Convention in the wake of Correa's election. That is the first constitution in the world, as I understand it, that actually explicitly grants nature or situates nature as a rights-bearing subject. So my first question has to do with that. You know, where does this cleavage between the lefts beyond the question of, not to say extractivism, but beyond the question of the horizons for an alternative to neoliberalism, what does it actually put on the table in terms of rethinking the entire sort of panoply of rights within which then nature can have a different characterization?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's interesting because someone asked in a recent book event, a different, like, also zoomed in on this rights of nature, but I just want to actually bring up their question too because it's like an interesting additional angle, and they asked, like, how could this have made it into the Constitution given Correa's
Yes,
right? And what I love about this question, which I think actually speaks to your work and Gianpaolo's work in shared ways, is just that, like, you know, these executives and the government administrations had no like full control over what the left project was. Like that, in fact, their election just occasioned a contest over what is the left and how deep is this transformation, right? And so I think it sort of goes against narratives that just like equate like the individual leader. I know that you and I have discussed this many times in terms of the discourse around populism, but I think the rights of nature just shows that Correa did not fully control the Constituent Assembly by any means, even though he tried to intervene at various points. And so it made it in there because of the work of environmentalists and also a group of environmental lawyers that had helped to articulate this concept actually around the world. And it absolutely, I think movements very much saw the rights of nature as like a step beyond what classical leftism had offered them, and it became part of the way that they critiqued, maybe in sometimes that flattened sometimes a little bit things, but you know, so that happens with critiques, right? Sort of almost equated like 21st century socialism, which was Correa's and other leaders around the hemisphere, their political self-identity, equated it with like 500 years of the history of colonialism, extractivism, and imperialism, and movements sort of sought to pinpoint the ways in which even socialism, or at least the version of socialism that they got under these left populist governments, you know, whether we want to actually call that socialism is also like another question. But I think, you know, it's interesting and important that the term was being used, right? So, and I always defer to actors' emic, you know, descriptions of themselves. So this was what socialism was called. And what socialism felt like in practice to these movements was this reproduction of extractivism, right? And one of the ways that they critiqued it and sort of stuck a hole in it was to say that this reproduction of extractivism also reproduces these liberal kind of ideas of what a political subject is, what political agency is, what the relationship between the nation and the state is, what territorial boundaries are like, right? What the political community is. And they did this in a few ways. So endowing rights of nature is one. And relatedly, I would say also is the sense that non-human nature as political agency is another. And there's a lot of fascinating anthropological work that shows that this is actually a common vision and concept among indigenous communities around the Americas. You know, the idea that mountains, for example, typically in highland, you know, indigenous communities have some kind of political presence and speak politics to some degree. So that's another way in which they did that. And then there's the related concept of plurinationalism, which really kind of deconstructs the political community, right? Instead of this mestizaje kind of one national demos, the idea is that there are many nations, ethnicities, there's like a plural collectivity, right? And that we should even rethink like what the boundaries kind of the state are and what the political communities are that are kind of encompassed by it. So I think this pops up in lots of ways. The difficulty can be, though, and I actually you know, discovered this in interesting ways during my field work. I want to say, first of all, that I think these are trenchant and deep critiques that political theorists are only like catching up to, right? So I want to like sort of give them their full due, but I also think that there are complexities around mobilizing nature as a political subject. on the one hand, there have been some real victories. Actually, movements have taken the rights of nature to court, and they lost the first few cases, including one that I was there to witness, but then they started sometimes winning cases, right? So they were actually able to deploy this legal right in order to slow down extraction or agricultural projects, right? And development projects. So that's a good example. More challenging is, I'll just relate, and I'll end here, like really quick story I mentioned during the talk that one of the things that activists did was plan these nature walks. And what they would do is take themselves and us, community members would usually be the leaders, through a place that wasn't yet extracted from, but the government wanted to extract. And what they were trying to do was like shore up the real political commitment to this space to defend it from extraction, and create alliances between environmentalists that might have come from other parts of the country. Anyway, these walks were amazing. I learned a huge amount. Some of the photographs were from them, but there was one in particular where it started to rain so hard that we had to leave, right? And this is like it's a little bit of a silly anecdote, but I'm just going to leverage it to say that like sometimes nature doesn't cooperate, right? So there are ways in which like, how do we actually treat nature as an ally and an agent? And these are like difficult questions that I think indigenous communities have a lot to teach us, but also in the contemporary political context sometimes is a complicated task.
Yeah, no, that really nicely brings up something else that I was wondering about. It sounds to me, but also from reading the book, that one of the great challenges of conducting this kind of ethnographic, but also political theoretical work is that you are simultaneously walking on, sometimes literally, quite unstable terrain, but that also theoretically the subject positions of the actors that you're engaging are themselves shifting all the time. And so it's very difficult to pinpoint, how political agendas intersect with political agents who are in themselves also shifting and altering their positions as conditions change, right? And a left comes to power, another one is, as you said, in resistance, but then that shifts the horizon of opportunity, etc. So I guess one of the questions that I have is, how to think about cleavages internal to, for instance, the indigenous population and the indigenous movement more broadly. Because again, one of the things that I think you do really well in the book is to not do the easy thing, which is to say, well, indigenous movements have a kind of unitary position vis-a-vis questions of extraction, vis-a-vis questions of development. Some of it is refracted through the lens of sovereignty, as you mentioned, with plurinationalism. And so it's really about, are the resources going to come back to our community as opposed to the development of the resources themselves, right? So I wonder if you could map out a little bit more, how we can think about those internecine kind of understandings of indigenous community in the case of Ecuador as refracted through the lens of these extractivist concerns.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll just say up front that I think despite your generous framing of the question, it is, I think, in some ways a shortcoming of my book, though of course no book can do everything, which is that in the anti-extractive moment, once that is like the movement position, I don't dwell so much on the fact that is obvious to any scholar, including myself, that has studied extractivism, that there are communities that embrace extraction, right? I don't actually dwell on that very much. But the way that I get at what you're talking about, which is cleavages, different positions, and also just like a granular nuance of different stances that movements might take between yes and no, right? Like between like we're okay with extraction or we don't want it at all, of which there's just like infinite positions to take. The way that I do that is kind of display it as a change over time, right? Which is just then it's just one axis. And I think another scholar could have shown that at the moment of that anti-extractive sort of crystallization, that range was still prevalent, but I don't focus on that as much, but I capture it historically. And I'll just give like a couple of thoughts. As I said, and dramatically simplified in this talk, like the prior kind of prevailing position of indigenous communities as they were organized into political and anti-capitalist movements, which is not all indigenous communities, of course, starting in the early 1990s and going on basically up until Correa's election and his ascent to power in 2007, was this nationalist framing that is familiar to us as an anti-imperialist third world nationalism, right? It's not the same as like Trump's xenophobic nationalism, right? This is a nationalism that comes from anti-colonial struggle across the third world and then global south. And the idea is that in order to have, and you use the word sovereignty, so I'm going to just repeat it, and Adam Getachu's, book World Making After Empire makes this very clear. But the idea that, like, in order, the idea among anti-colonial like leaders, intellectuals, and activists was, we can't have full political sovereignty until we have full economic sovereignty and control, right? So this is like a refrain across Africa, South Asia, and elsewhere. And so that was like a prevailing kind of idea among indigenous activists that were very much in that thought world in the 1990s. However, even in the 90s, and this the book does get to, there was a sense of different positionalities, because while the movement and its leadership was somewhat dominated by the highland indigenous federations, when you went to the Amazon, which had their own, subnational federation and their own representation in the national federation as well, when you went to the Amazon, you saw the inkling of what I call, like, it's a little inelegant, like proto anti-extractivism, meaning like it wasn't a full-fledged critique of extractivismo that connected it across like time and space and all extractive sectors. It was specifically about oil exploration in the southern Amazon that was encroaching on communities that had not previously been looped into the extractive economy, unlike the northern Amazon, which had decades of extraction, right? And so in the northern Amazon, we could even go there and say, there was obviously all range of different community responses to it, but we'll be in the southern Amazon in the 1990s, and they started to develop pretty militant tactics to defend their territory, including like detaining oil executives and government ministers in their planes when they tried to like do site visits for exploration, right? And they were accused of like kidnapping in the press and X, Y, and Z. But it was effective because they actually, like, that's how they got their demands met, to the extent that they did. And so but those movements, I want to say, and here's to answer your exact, where you led in your question, weren't always saying, and actually weren't generally saying, we want no extraction, nor were they even saying we want no oil necessarily. What they were saying was often the following. One was, in some cases, they demanded a moratorium on oil extraction until rights could be better protected, a certain time period. Okay. In other cases, they said indigenous peoples, the Shuar, Achuar, Amazonian Quichua, Kofan, Sequoia, the indigenous peoples of the Amazon should have veto power, which means that an individual community can say yes if they want, but the idea is that their territorial rights ground certain political rights, right? And so those were the different positions that movements started to articulate as the extractive frontier expanded southward. And then it was in this sort of explosive political moment, like a decade later, in which they articulated, and all of those different kind of source ideas articulated into a wholesale rejection of extraction that became, I don't want to say every indigenous person, of course not, or even a politicized left-wing indigenous movement member held an anti-extractive view, but it became the norm. Like almost everyone I spoke to and encountered to an interview, way beyond what's displayed in the book, basically subscribed to the idea that extractivismo was the problem and post-extractivism was the solution.
Yeah. One last question, and we'll bring in others. I definitely want to get to the Green New Deal question, but I know that Gianpaolo posed this, so I'll let him do so better than I could. But I have a question that's more about method, and it speaks a little bit to well, something you and I have talked about at times, but in a place like Gallatin in particular, I think is especially salient, which is, I feel like it's fair to say that you're probably not the standard cut cloth of political scientist. You incorporate not only ethnographic methodology, but also archival. And yet at the same time, the kind of arguments that you're making are rooted in questions of normative relations and understandings and framings, right? So, you don't have to go too much into depth on this, but I wonder how you navigate that space of interdisciplinarity in a discipline, like from the standpoint of a discipline like political science, that has tended to be, I think it's fair to say, resistant to some of that approach. And then what do you find useful in it? And how has that helped you to elicit some of the questions that you've tackled?
Yeah, it's a great question that we could definitely both probably go on about quite a bit. And as someone, as a historian, even though maybe like some of your methods are less like starkly out of the norm of history, I think studying like recent urban popular
Right.
movements
Sure.
and using the types of like hidden archives that you had to access is like, itself, I'm sure was like subject to challenges and legibility concerns. And that's like exactly, I mean, I kind of chose like, I'm going to study large scale mining in Ecuador, pay a lot of attention to discourse, and also weave in some political theory. And it was like, no one in political science cares about Ecuador. I mean, now they actually do more, a little bit more in a way, not Ecuador, but like the sort of the this kind of like, because in large part, actually, because of Venezuela, right? So like, it's like now a geopolitical security kind of concern in the region. But at that moment, a decade ago, it was not yet at that high level. Mining, weirdly, and you probably know this because you've studied oil a lot, but I'll just say to others, is very understudied in political science. It's studied much more in anthropology and history, but it's like there's nothing on mining. And then discourse, like, why would you study discourse when we're talking about political economy? And then the political theory is just like, okay, you're gonna like quadruply marginalize yourself, right? Oh, and ethnography is like the other thing. So I basically set myself up for a difficult dissertation defense. No, but I had some great advisors and supporters in the department. But yeah, it was a challenge, and I think that like the challenge I tried to convert into I don't want to say into an opportunity, but into like an occasion to say that like all of social life, I mean, if analyzed critically and with the proper historic depth and bringing to bear kind of like concerns that concern like many people around the world, any swath of social life you want to study can really tell you something about the global conjuncture, right? It's just like and this is like actually an insight of like world systems theory, of commodity histories that like might trace some really particular thing, and like how does it travel and what does it tell us? And of course, anthropological cultural ethnographies can do this quite well. And so it was like, the challenge was to show like, what is it, like the world in a grain of sand type of thing. But I think that's a better way to set yourself up to stay tethered to sort of concrete realities rather than to like study the world as if not, revealed in the grains of sand of social reality. So, it took years to figure out how to do that well. And it's actually something that in my current project continues to reemerge because it's a more transnational project, but thereby like the challenge of making sure that the connections are clear is kind of amplified. But I'm glad it worked well for you as a reader.
So, I mean, yes, no doubt. And hopefully it'll inspire others, which is the dream. So thank you so much for doing that. All right, so let's open it up. So I know Gianpaolo, you posed some questions in the chat. Maybe I can ask you to, if you want to unmute. I think that we have that capacity. Let's see. Which one is this one? It's allowed. Is that you? Is this one? Gianpaolo? It's like one of those seances.
I know he's one of these two. Maybe he can't. Oh no, I can't unmute him.
Well, I'll just read it. So how do you draw lines between this research and your Green New Deal work? And just maybe to elaborate that a little bit more, as I mentioned in the introduction, not only are you, deeply involved with DSA, Democratic Socialist of America's sort of efforts to bring the Green New Deal to a policy discussion, but also have written extensively about Green New Deal as not only a political horizon, but really a planetary urgency. And so, but on the other hand, there are also, as you know, and you mentioned a little bit, there are, the term doesn't translate literally, but also politically extremely well, certainly around the Americas. So where do you see these two intersect?
Yeah. So I think that, and I'm also happy to answer Gianpaolo's like more contentious, well, it's not, I don't know that he means it's contentious, but the question about current Ecuadorian politics, if we want to go there. But I'll start with the first one, which I think there's two different angles that I would approach it at. So one is like, what's the connection between my research on resource extraction in the Americas and elsewhere, and the Green New Deal? And then the other is like, what is like the Green New Deal kind of, what conversations is it embedded in across the Americas around like similar ideas, right, of like kind of social and ecological transformation? So I'll kind of treat them one at a time. I decided a couple years ago now to study lithium extraction, starting in Chile, but now it's sort of gone elsewhere in the world as well, because I wanted to understand what would like a Green New Deal, for example, mean in terms of resource extraction elsewhere in the world. Would a Green New Deal mean less extraction? Would it mean more extraction? Would it mean different types of extraction? And I felt like it was a question that um, climate change, climate justice activists were not actually always asking, like, kind of almost assuming that if we transition to renewable energy and lower carbon societies, that like we just won't have the problem of extraction anymore, because extraction is so connected to the idea of fossil capitalism and fossil fuels that like maybe like a Green New Deal economy would be like a post-extractive economy automatically, right? And so what I started to dig, no pun intended, a little bit like around this issue, and realized that like actually, and unfortunately, there's a lot of new forms of mining, particularly, that are relevant in a post-oil, post-coal, post-gas, kind of post-hydrocarbon, I can just say, world. And in fact, maybe even more mining than in that world, because of the rapid and massive deployment of like physical infrastructures in the world, from like wind turbines to lithium ion batteries, to transmission lines, solar panels, which is like the infrastructure that allows us to actually use renewable energy and store it and distribute it. All of that is a lot of physical stuff. And we make physical stuff in human society using minerals, as well as compounds synthesized in labs and fabricated in all sorts of ways. But at the base of everything that we make is stuff that comes from the earth, right? And with its own environmental impacts. So what that kind of put me on the path towards was like, what would a Green New Deal look like that actually required less resource extraction, not more, including of the minerals that we need for a Green New Deal, like lithium, right? So I don't, this is an interesting place where we get into the limits, I would say, and I want to be as generous as possible here, the limits to a certain mode of anti-extractivism that says like there is just a world in which we extract nothing. Or maybe like a better way to put it is it puts some daylight between extraction and extractivism, right? Because I certainly think that extractivism is like a system that is bad, like capitalism, right? But extraction, or maybe we need even a different word, like some form of like nonviolent appropriation from nature, is just something that, humans as other non-human animals, also engage in, right? And so we need to metabolize nature in some way. But the question is always how much and under whose conditions and with what power relations and at what volume and rate and where in the world. Does it always have to come from the global south? Does it always have to affect the same sacrifice zones in the world and follow these 500-year-long patterns of neocolonial, world system? Like, can we do it otherwise, right? And so I think, I'm not going to answer all those questions. Come to my next talk. No, I mean, I talk, that's something I'm working on, and I have some writing on it if folks are interested, but I think it always redounds to thinking about, can we transition to this new renewable energy system in a way that is less resource and material intensive, that involves less of a material footprint on the earth, and thereby actually stokes less resource conflict and has fewer opportunities to run up against like the preferences of communities that may not rightfully want that extraction, right? So that's one line of connection. And then the other is like thinking about hemispheric dialogues around progressive visions of how do we get out of this mess, like COVID, the post-COVID recovery, how do we get out of the climate crisis in a way that's socially just? And, as usual, Latin America has lots of ideas here. In fact, some of those ideas were part of the broad conversations that even resulted in the Green New Deal, we could say. I would say, Latin America, and I'm not alone in saying this, I've just been at the forefront in thinking about what the negatives are of extraction, right, and of the fossil fuel economy and on all of those sorts of things. So that there's like an input there, but also more broadly, there are these interesting conversations, I mentioned them very briefly, around the Pacto Ecosocial, Nuestra América Verde. And what I think the Latin America conversations, and they don't use the Green New Deal, though many of their authors and advocates see themselves in explicit conversation with the Nuevo Trato Verde, or there's different translations of it that are a little wonky. They see themselves in conversation with it. But what I think they have done well is to highlight the regional and global scales of responsibility for the transition. And what I mean by that is that if you're in Ecuador, you have kind of, and you're a left-wing and environmentalist and social justice activist, this imaginary person in Ecuador, which there are many, you have probably learned at this point that it is difficult, even giving the full benefit of the doubt to the Correa administration, right? It is difficult for one country in the peripheries of the world system, highly dependent on commodity exports, to transition to eco-socialism, right? We have the famous quote, like, can you do socialism in one country? Well, what about like eco-socialism in like an oil-dependent economy with a GDP that is like a fraction of the US's, right? That is also now in high and unsustainable levels of sovereign debt to a variety of private creditors. And it just like, it feels intractable because you need to meet people's needs, right? And you also need to stop devastating the environment and violating indigenous rights. And so what I think the Ecuadorian case shows us is that these decisions and forms of redistribution, like both planning and redistribution, have to happen at like broader scales. And there's like an interesting opportunity, I think, for regional planning around like creating a regional economy that would be more ecologically and socially just, but also around like demanding like the cancellation of sovereign debt, which I'm like a huge proponent of, because just like student debt keeps us trapped in cycles of working jobs we won't want to work, sovereign debt keeps countries trapped in extractivism because it's like the easy revenue that you can pay off the international debtors and so creditors, excuse me. So I think we have to kind of learn from Latin America, we in the global north, that like internationalism and also redistribution beyond a single country are important for like a just transition in a place like Ecuador.
I mean, the way that you just framed it in terms of expecting a country with a fraction of the GDP of the United States or other, global North countries to undertake this challenge on its own or to start it is, in some ways, it's a kind of a reinscribing of a particular kind of colonial dynamic.
Yeah.
Now it's up to the global South to do the thing that that would actually be extremely difficult to start. But this, I guess, speaks to a second question that that Gianpaolo raised, and I just want to contextualize it a little bit, which has to do with, well, what is the left response, or what should be the left response to the kinds of left cleavages that we see in Latin America emerging, certainly around questions of resource extraction and what that implies. And just to ground that a little bit more, and you certainly feel free to to take this in whatever direction you want. As you mentioned, the latest round of presidential elections in Ecuador did pit these two lefts to some extent in opposition to one another. And one of the ways that the candidate that's most identified with the anti-extractivist left, Evo Perez, has sort of articulated the response on the part of the pro-Correísta, say developmentalist, extractivist left, is been to suggest that it's possible, perhaps even necessary, to align with global financial sectors like the International Monetary Fund in order to maybe decarbonize the economy, which sounds a little bit like a devil's bargain, number one, but also picking between a rock and a hard place, or no good options, whatever metaphor you want to use. And so I guess maybe an approach to the question would be that, I mean, is the answer to resource curse ever imply a choice that is actually not in itself a trade-off, whether it's a financial one or whether it's an environmental one? And so how do you think about the current situation in Ecuador in the context of that trade-off system?
Yeah, it's a great question that I'm going to do my best to answer. I'm going to give even a little more context to people not following the Ecuadorian elections. So I will say that there were seemingly many more people in the US on the left, like following it than I would have expected. And so, because people ask me like, what do you think? What should I think? Whatever. So, so it was an interesting moment. And so basically there was a initial election like a month and a half ago, who knows what time is anymore, recently, a first round, and it could have been won outright, but it was not, and so it goes to a second round. And the three candidates that got the most votes, number one was Andrés Arauz, who is like considered like a protege of Correa, and Correa has been a close advisor to his campaign from afar. And he is a leftist and carrying on the banner of Alianza País, though the party has been renamed for various reasons, but regardless. Okay, so there's Andrés Arauz. Then vying for second place, and that vying word is important because that itself was the subject of dispute and litigation, like who's going to come in second, was on the one hand Yacu Perez, who's actually a figure that appears several times in my book under the name Carlos Perez, because he then renamed himself after my fieldwork and had taken place. But regardless, so Yacu Perez is an anti-extractive leader from the Southern Highlands, actually one of the leaders that has helped stall that mine that still hasn't happened that I referred to earlier, right? And he's also a leader has been a leader at various kind of levels of the federated indigenous movement, including the president of Ecuador, the regional Highland Regional Federation. So he's Pachacutic's candidate, the indigenous party, political party associated with CONAI. And then there is Guillermo Lasso. It is his third time running for president. He will just like keep on trying. He's a right-wing banker that no matter how much he rebrands himself, it's hard for a majority of Ecuadorians to elect a right-wing banker, also because of his particular role and wealth, and actually like wealth and benefiting from the financial crisis of the late 1990s, right? So he has a bit of a sordid history, but he keeps trying. Anyway, so it looked at first like Yacu Perez, before there was a full and formal vote count, there was like a quick kind of count, not exactly like what happened in Bolivia, but I'll just, use that so people have a sense. Like there was this count that was based on, I think, 97% of the votes. And it looked like Yacu Perez was going to be in second, in which case my book would like be on the ballot box in a way that I had never predicted, right? But then several days later, there was, the fuller count had been completed. And then Guillermo Lasso had like it wasn't a big difference, don't quote me, but maybe in the low thousands or something like that, difference between the two. So, but Guillermo Lasso, and so that sets up a more left-right classic kind of binary for the second round. Arauz, as I said, got the most votes, but not enough to win outright. So this sets off like a whole political period that I will not even get into, that feels very long, even though it's just like a few weeks, in which Perez and some of his followers like contested the election results, claiming massive fraud. There were reasons I could understand people could have concerns about the vote outcomes, which are less about evidence of fraud and more about the fact that Pachacuti got like a higher percentage of votes in the assembly than it did for the president, which is a little unusual. But it's worth saying that Pachacuti got the most votes for both the National Assembly, the legislature, and Yacu Perez, its indigenous, presidential candidate, than it's ever gotten, for either, right? So it did very well, but usually it's more similar, the legislative and the executive. And so that's like one reason, but I don't want to like make a proclamation here or go on the record with anything, but I just have not heard or seen evidence of wide scale fraud, though there might have been more minor, issues. I'm not sure. However, basically what we have now is Arauz versus Lasso, and like the differences between them are, I think, clearer and easier for both of them to articulate than the differences would be, when you have the anti-extractive left. That would have been a more complicated election, I think, actually, for both parties, right? And it points to some of the trade-offs that you say, and one of them I'll just mention, and again, without getting myself into trouble, hopefully, I don't know how many people will watch this recording, is that, at certain junctures, Yacu Perez, despite being, I think, a committed and good faith and like very, authentically held beliefs around anti-extractivism, has put himself into situations, I'll just phrase it carefully, in which he appears to make tacit, instrumental, or tactical and temporary alliances with right-wing forces. And the reason is, as couldn't be more obvious to someone who studies Venezuela, which is that there is like an anti-Correísta popular front in some ways, right? And it's not really, I don't know if I'd call it a popular front, but it's like a position to occupy that right and left can sometimes occupy. But once you do, then you get into tricky territory, especially I think the left gets into tricky territory, right? And so, there have been moments where Yacu Perez says things, both in terms of alliances, but also on a policy level, like his lack of clarity around whether he would take a hard line with the IMF or not, right? And I think that speaks, on the one hand, to anti-Correísmo being a unifying force among both anti-extractive left and right-wing right, but on the other hand, the sort of like difficulties and dilemmas pervading like a post-extractive transition. How do you do that without like the financial support of the global, community, or without at certain points making tactical alliances with groups, along the way? And I think that those are real questions. I'll just end by saying what I think Arauz will do a little bit, or I should say what I think the indications and political signals are that Arauz is sending. One is, I'll say that Arauz is not Correa, and that's obvious. They're two different humans born at two different moments, right? But a lot of the time, especially with Latin American presidents, there's a tendency to conflate people from the same party as if they're carbon copies of one another, which is just an exoticizing simplification that is very annoying to people that study history or, the granularity of politics. So Arauz is not Correa. And what I mean by that is actually personality-wise, even if we care about that kind of, individual personality stuff, he's quite different. He's not as Correa loved a conflict, right? Which was part of what drove the conflict to be so polarized. It can't be under it can't be sort of overstated that he played a role in that fracture by just almost, I don't want to say enjoying, but almost seeming to enjoy conflict of any sort, including with the left, right? And drawing boundaries between friend and enemy. That was like a common sort of, whereas Arauz is not that way. You can just tell if you watch a video or listen to something. He's just like not that, he's not like as intensely charismatic or as intensely polarizing as Correa is. He's also, this is maybe a little bit even more important, more of a progressive in a modern and recognizable sense. And what I mean by that, or contemporary, not modern, what I mean by that is that Correa has some very, I think, indefensible views, whatever one might think about him. And I think that he's a complex figure that I do not just dismiss whatsoever. And I think of an extremely intelligent politician. However, he has what I view as non-defensible views on social rights around abortion, marriage, sexuality, gender, and things like that. He's a Catholic conservative, right? Arauz is not. He's like, progressive, woke, whatever you want to call him. And then I think the third thing is that Arauz seems more attuned, though I'm not sure how much more, but more attuned to the limitations of an extractive model of development. And he has critiqued not only Alianza País's like own past sort of policies and the way that it related to society. So that's a good sign. He's somewhat self-critical about the party, but also saying that like, we haven't industrialized this way. We haven't actually climbed the ladder of development. So like, what are we going to do? And like, so he's posed those questions, I think, and he has a very strong heterodox economist background, and, we'll see how he navigates this if he wins. But I think there's reasons to at least like treat him with a different analytical lens than Correa.
Well, to go no further than Lenin Moreno, who was
exactly on the other side,
the carbon copy of Rafael Correa.
Exactly, and has a 6% approval rating, and like is has been disowned by his party and whatever, right? So that just goes to show how individuals matter, not because they determine everything, but there's all these idiosyncrasies.
Right. So we have another question from Mehmet. So can you comment on the parallels and contrasts between extractivism in Africa versus South America as far as Chinese mining companies' operations are concerned?
I can't fully comment on that, except that I'm going to go outside of my area, and I don't want to comment. I think especially with like distinct geographic regions, it's important to know one's limits. I think that, I'll point to some vague similarities and then some vague differences, but it's possible that Mehmet like knows more than me about both. One is, in both Africa, and we can just even take the case of South Africa, and in Latin American countries with long histories of resource dependency, oil and mining workers, in the case of South Africa mining, right, but in Latin America, oil and mining workers have been really important militant protagonists, and have developed ideas of anti-imperialism and the way that it connects to labor struggle. So I think that's like a very interesting parallel I didn't get into this in the talk at all, but in the book, I chronicle a bit the role of oil workers in articulating resource nationalism in Latin America, and in Latin America broadly, but also specifically in Ecuador, and of actually engaging in very militant forms of like pipeline protests when there was like a foreign-owned pipeline and they thought no pipeline should be owned by, not the Ecuadorian government. And you have to, one can also go further back in history to like the tin miners of Bolivia and their role and having like a Trotskyist union in the 1930s. And of course, June Nash's excellent book covers some of this, but the idea of like the way that miners have had this historic kind of militancy to the way that they confront their bosses, but also to the way that they conceive of the world system, I think is like a parallel across those two cases, right? Where I think that we get into more granular differences that will go beyond my knowledge is that there are certainly cases in Nigeria, for example, of communities taking on quite anti-extractive and fossil fuel, anti-fossil, in that case, anti-oil positions and getting killed for it, right? So that gives them two things in common with Latin American, their comrades in Latin America, and going up, against some of the same companies in some circumstances. What I've learned, for example, and this is just, and I hate to just like cherry pick a community, but I'm just going to bring it up just as a counterexample. I'm doing this work on lithium battery supply chains, and I work on lithium, but there's also cobalt is in batteries, right? And cobalt is primarily sourced from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there's all of these like really intense human rights allegations and just clear episodes of human rights violations related to worker safety, related to the prevalence of child labor, related to environmental hazards, all sorts of things. And so companies have been saying, we're going to just stop using cobalt in our batteries. We're going to figure out a different chemistry. We're just going to leave, right? Which is obviously not a just response to that issue, right? You need to remediate. And what communities have been saying is, no, we don't want you to leave. We don't want the end of this sector. What we want is like a much more socially just and better regulated sector. And the reason I bring up this specific example is to say that like not all communities everywhere in the world, including in Latin America, but especially also elsewhere, are like per se anti-extractive, right? Not all communities want the companies to leave. And what I've learned a little bit through this study, which is exposing me to other regions of the world, is that it was in Latin America that this particular form of militant opposition to extraction took particular hold of communities, or I shouldn't say took hold of them like it was a nefarious force, but meaning like they articulated that oppositional stance. Not every community, but more communities in Latin America than elsewhere in the world. And so I think we just have to be sort of attuned to like the fact that like militancy can take different forms and social demands and grievances can take different forms. And there are communities that would like a different form of extraction rather than an end to it. And then there are communities that would like an end to it, right? And so that's, I guess, it's me kind of grasping at we're getting to the limits of my knowledge, but I think it's a good question, and I wish I had a co-panelist that could answer it better than me.
No, thank you. I think we have time for one more. Is there anyone who would like to raise their hand? No? Okay, then I will take the last question. And this actually gets back a little bit to the argument of the book, but you ended with what actually seemed to me to be a bit of a provocative claim, which is that these two lefts are in fact intertwined. And I think both in your responses to the Ecuadorian election and in your response to to the nuancing of indigenous movement cleavages, etc., it's not entirely clear to me that they are intertwined so much as to some extent counterposed. And so I guess I would want to hear a little bit more about the precision of that interrelationship or that mutual constitution. And if it is something that you see as resolvable, or that's not the language to think about this through, or maybe to think about it as a productive tension rather than a destructive one. But certainly, I mean, some of the language coming out of the election, especially on Perez's camp, but also in Arauz's camp, was far more was far more mutually destructive than productive. So I guess I just want to hear you speak a little bit more about where you see the points of contact.
Yeah, I love the question, and you're right. It's like an aspirational claim rather than a strictly empirical one, but it has some empirical grounding. And I'll say one other framing piece, and then I'll kind of answer it, which is I mentioned earlier in response to a question, I think, that I tend to defer to emic categories, which is a fancy way of saying that I tend to defer to how actors self-position themselves and also how they describe themselves, the political landscape, right? However, this is a place I depart, and I depart from them precisely in order to be generous to the various sides. Because if I stuck with emic categories, I would end on a note of like mutually incompatible sharp criticism, and I just couldn't sit with, in part out of a gesture. I don't mean that in a tokenistic sense, but a meaningful gesture of solidarity from the global north to say that, like, sort of, who am I to judge? I mean, these are multiple routes and conceptions of transformation that were born of intense struggles and pit sometimes comrades, friends, and family members against one another, right? And so I kind of want to say that there's roles and reasons to both of them. And that's how I end the book, which is then also how I end the talk. But what do I mean by intertwined? And I think that productively, in productive tension is also viable. And so is this mutual constitution thing. I mean, and actually they are mutually constituted, even if they don't like each other. So what I mean by that is, first, as I say at more length in the book, of course, that goes without saying, the condition of the left coming to power was a left set of left movements, right? The left movements before the left came to power was a broad popular front, was a sort of like heterogeneous popular bloc, and it involved people that may have disagreed on certain things but could agree on one thing, which was that neoliberalism was the enemy, right? And the IMF was the enemy, and the US needed to get out of military bases in Latin America, X, Y, and Z that we're familiar with. So there was like a shared set of left reference points that people with otherwise different subject positions, ideological formations, et cetera, could sort of get around. And that's the utility of the right wing being in power, because when the right is in power, lots of people can agree. We experienced this under Trump, right? Like, lots of people with lots of different opinions can basically agree that this is bad. The problem is when the left comes to power, and this is like a story of every revolutionary process in the world and every, parliamentary road to socialism process in the world, which is that the minute you get to power, those differences become extremely clear. You feel like you're under a microscope, and it's like everyone can see exactly, where they deviate from the next person. And this is how revolutionary coalitions fragment, turn against one another, sectarianism emerges. I mean, this is like a very common story, right? So the fact that you're born of a similar process does not mean that when you get to power, that things don't begin to fall apart. But I still think the shared roots are, in a way, what makes the fight so intense. Like, we don't fight with anyone more than our family, than our, than our, sometimes our best friends and our political comrades, because we actually share something with them, and it's very important to sort of get it right, and it's sort of more heated for that reason. So I think, in a way, the intensity of the debate speaks to, like, that there's something underlying. And so that's another thing that I would say. And then, kind of going along with that, in a ironic or like unexpected way, it was the left coming to power that then was the condition of the emergence of anti-extractivism, which didn't fully exist as a political ideology previous to that, or a framework or a critique, whatever you want to call it, previous to that. So they're sort of like layered and intertwined, but yet also in tension with one another. And then, why do I think that they both need to exist? I kind of say why in the talk, but I'll add like one other piece, which is that the left movements, even when they're in total oppositional resistance, I think make left governments better, both because, and this is, in the case of Venezuela, is very clear, and it wasn't as total opposition, but it was like militant, like, kind of like Chavez, you need to be a socialist. Like, why are you just a nationalist kind of thing? I mean, like, pushing him to engage in much more redistributive policies. In the case of Korea, there were movements pushing in that direction too, but there were also, the result of movements is that some projects that maybe are just too ecologically damaging and too contentious with indigenous communities just didn't get developed, right? And so without the movements, we would have had more extraction. And I think that like the government wouldn't have had to defend both in policy, redistributive policy and rhetoric, the extraction as much. Of course, part of that defense is criminalization of movements. So I'm not trying to say that like every response that movements occasion is good for those movements, but if movements are effective, they can hold accountable and extract concessions that would not have occurred without them. So, you know, I think left governments without movements, we saw that actually happen at moments during the pink tide when there was tremendous demobilization and those governments got unmoored from their social bases, and they actually, that was part of their own downfall. So even for their own, I think, self-interest, having a constant level of mobilization and engagement is positive. I mean, these are all, like, we could keep going, and Gianpaolo's book is really on this, you know, the book on popular sovereignty, but I think that they're both necessary. Whether they think that the other is necessary is, you know, a different question for sure.
That's great. No, it's so clear and politically urgent. Thank you so much. Well, you have been immensely generous with your time, with your research, with your thinking. I thank you on behalf of UDL. I thank you on behalf of Gallatin, and I would be remiss if I didn't tell folks that you also co-edited with Dan Aldana Cohen a special issue of the NACLA report on the Americas last summer, which is precisely on the Green New Deal in the Americas and bringing in authors from the region, activists as well, to think through a lot of these issues of crossover between the two regions. So if anybody's interested, you can check that out on the NACLA.org website. Sorry for that small plug.
No, it's fine. It's a great issue. I agree.
Yeah, great, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Thea, and we will see you soon, I hope, in person.
Great, likewise. Bye-bye.
Ciao.